what they expect out of the water resources and what's going to drive it. But Colorado has a long way to go on this. And just the fact that you're hearing numbers like adding $50,000 in the price of a house just for the acquisition of water.
75.
75.
That's not including the tap and impact fees.
No, that's just like, yeah.
That's just the drop of water.
Yeah, so in Reno, for example, when you hook up the sewer and water, the total cost was like $35,000. But of that, $10,000 was for water. The rest was like the infrastructure, which is like, okay, that costs money. So anyway, that's my perspective on it. That'll get me in trouble. Yeah.
All right, thanks, John. What are the policy practices that could have had, because like roughly 2011 is when CBT went up in value, right? It's been hockey sticking, but that was driven by the capital markets and the demand. So what could have happened back in 2011, 12 that could have curbed the cost of that? Because now you're
Can I try to answer this?
now policies fighting with capital markets and capitalism.
Okay, we can talk about this in lunch.
Yeah.
20 minutes. It's kind of a complicated answer.
We have time for discussion after Patty. I want to make sure we give Patty enough time to present too. So hold that question. John's going to be here, and we'll return to that. So thank you, gentlemen. I would like to introduce Patty Reddick. She is the head archivist at the Water Resources Archive at Colorado State University Library. Patty has built the archive to hold over 100 distinct collections documenting Colorado's water heritage by engaging with water communities across the state. This involves working with people throughout the university as well as with state and federal agencies, ditch companies, businesses, and individuals. She earned her Master of Library Science from the University of Maryland, College Park, and her BA in English from Wittenberg University. She's been with the Water Resources Archive since its beginning in 2001. She works with individuals and organizations across the state to save historic documents related to Colorado's water resources and assists with students, faculty, and other researchers using the archival collections. She also conducts extensive outreach, articles, exhibits, and presentations to further the cause of preserving the state's water heritage. So let's welcome Patty.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you here today. It's always an exciting day for me when I get to talk about Colorado water history to new audiences. And as Karen just read through my bio, that is what I do all day, every day, is focus on Colorado water history. So what we're going to try, I guess I've got 20 minutes. Yeah, 20 plus minutes to get through about 170 years of history. So buckle your seatbelts. We're gonna make this work. As you just heard from John, state has limited water supply, increasing population throughout its history, across its history. So this sets up a formula for conflict, almost inevitably, but also out of that formula, that conflict can come collaboration and cooperation. So we do see quite a bit of that over the history of the state. So what we're going to do here is we're going to cover water history across the state. We're going to cover highlights. We're not going to hit everything. So there's a lot more to what I'm saying. I'm happy to provide additional resources should you want them. And we're going to kind of go in a timeline fashion. So we're going to talk about some dates, but again, just the highlights and going through the story. Okay, so to begin, so the settlement of Colorado really began in the early 1850s, and this was through what we now call the San Luis Valley, so up from the south. It was actually part of Mexico at that time, but by 1852, the Hispanic settlers there were establishing their communities, establishing agriculture, and had dug what's called the People's Ditch, and that facility is known, or that ditch is known as the first water right in the state of Colorado. So going back to 1852, it's an acequia system there, and that's an irrigation system and community system, way of life that came from northern Africa and Spain, and was brought up through Mexico into what's now New Mexico and the southern part of Colorado. So irrigation, but also community management. It's important to northern Colorado and this region for a number of reasons. I'm going to highlight one person here, and I feel like I'm in everybody's way at some point, so I'm going to try to just keep roaming around. So if you can't see, just let me know. So the person I want to mention in relation to this, his name was Benjamin Eden. And he traveled through this area of the San Luis Valley in the late 1850s, early 1860s. He was coming into this area as a gold seeker. He wanted to make his fortune with gold, as so many others were doing in 1859, early 1860s. He passed through the region. He observed the irrigation practices there, what they were doing. And by the time he settled in the Poudre Valley in 1864, he had these ideas in mind of what he had observed there, the irrigation that they had going on. It had been starting in this area by then too, but he really got it going. He really had the ideas, the foresight to establish a number of ditches and make those work, move the water to the fields. And by 1884, he was governor of the state of Colorado. Probably have heard his name before. So throughout the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, there's increasing water use, primarily agriculture, but of course, municipal uses as well. Building more irrigation ditches, longer ones, bigger ones, big ones that would move more water, establishing reservoir systems as well. And in 1876, we have Colorado being established as a state. And so with that happening, we need a state constitution. So within the state constitution, that's where the law of private appropriation was established to manage water rights in the state. This part of the state constitution in part came out of a dispute, an earlier dispute in 1874 between Fort Collins and Greeley. So that was a situation where Greeley farmers in 1874 felt that they weren't getting all of the water they should be getting. They came up, visited Fort Collins, and Fort Collins is getting a lot of water. And so there was a conflict over that. And they basically worked out that the agreement should be that whoever had diverted the water first, whoever had built the facilities and done the work first, should have the right to the water. Because you can keep going further and further upstream to say, well, my ditch is farther up than yours, I should get the water first. But they decided to work it out on the basis of who had diverted first, who was putting water to use first. Oversimplified and high level, but that's the gist of it. And so some of those people who were involved in that dispute and working that out ended up being on the committee that was writing the state constitution. So there's a direct effect there. So that's 1876. By 1881, we have the state engineer's office being established for Colorado. The state engineer's office is also known as the Division of Water Resources. Modern logo here. But that state office is the one that manages and administers water rights across the state of Colorado. So 1881, they recognized this was needed. They set up the office, they set up the systems, how to do this, how to work all this out, to administer the different basins across the state. And at the time, they were still figuring out how to measure quantities of moving water, how to record it, how to manage it across the different basins and across time. So lots of work in getting that done. By the middle of that decade, the mid 1880s, they were still working on that, still getting the systems in place to monitor the rivers and the quantities of water available. At the time, in the middle of this decade, there was a young man who was hired to work at Colorado State, well, what's now Colorado State University, what was then the Colorado Agricultural College. He was hired as a professor of mathematics, but had a summer's free and actually had a background in engineering. And so he began working for the state engineer's office when he could, and actually helped establish the monitoring system for the Poudre River. That young man's name was Elvin Mead, and he eventually went to Wyoming to become their first state engineer and establish the water rights system for the state of Wyoming. If you've heard his name at all, probably because of Lake Mead. I heard some bells going off there. So Lake Mead, of course, is the reservoir behind Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam being built by the Bureau of Reclamation. Elvin Mead became the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation. And so he oversaw the building of Hoover Dam. When he died, they named that reservoir for him. And I love to tell people, he got his start right here in Fort Collins, in Western Water. So it's important national implications there. So speaking of the Bureau of Reclamation, that was really the federal government's first interaction with the states in terms of water projects. Bureau of Reclamation was started in 1902, and in 1903, they began their first water project here in Colorado, the Uncompahgre project. So that's on the western slope, involves the Uncompahgre River and the Gunnison River. Significant project there. First federal involvement here. And we'll talk more about another and a bigger Bureau of Reclamation project in a couple decades. But also at this time, we have litigation beginning to happen, some significant federal level litigation happening. So 1901, Kansas brought suit against Colorado in relation to the Arkansas River. As seen here, the case took until 1907 to be resolved. This was the first court case related to interstate water issues in the country. So Kansas bringing suit against Colorado, 1901 to 1907. By 1911, Wyoming brings suit against Colorado over interstate water issues. In that case, it is the Laramie River here in northern Colorado. There was a group called the Greeley-Poudre Irrigation District at the time that was trying to divert water from the Laramie River into the Poudre River. Wyoming wasn't very happy about this, right? It was going to decrease the supply to Wyoming. And so Wyoming brought suit against Colorado. Not the last interstate water court case to happen in the state. And people recognize this. I could list several other court cases that were beginning in this time frame, but we will keep moving. We will get to the 1920s when this man, Delph Carpenter, was recognizing that this was going to keep happening in all these downstream states, because all the states are downstream from Colorado, the headwater state. All these other states were going to keep bringing lawsuits against Colorado. Not a great position for Colorado to be in as far as litigation and the economics involved in this. So he started thinking, well, how can we prevent this? How can we eliminate this kind of litigation, or at least reduce this kind of litigation? So he had the idea of interstate river compacts. So this idea was about how to get states to agree on how to share rivers before litigation was going to happen, before there were big disputes going on. And all of this was in the interest of developing these rivers, putting the water to use. And when the court cases take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that really slows things down. And so part of it was protect Colorado. Let's prevent all these other states from interfering in what we're doing in Colorado. But also let's get this development going. Let's take down some of these obstacles and enable the development that we all know we want to happen. So Delph Carpenter was a water lawyer for Greeley. He's best known for accomplishing the Colorado River Compact. And I'm guessing if you paid attention to the news, you've heard about Colorado River issues and the current disputes going on in relation to the Colorado River Compact still today. It's literally still in newspapers, still being discussed. I like to remind people that this was a new idea. This hadn't ever been tried before. This was an innovation. This was an experiment. They were working this out. They were doing the best they could at the time. Certainly room for discussion, debate about what they had done 100 years ago, debate about that today. But I like to stress, nobody had ever done this before, so they were trying to work it out as best they could. Carpenter worked on a number of other things as well, including the South Platte River Compact, which was actually started in 1920. The whole Colorado River Compact thing got in the way, but it was concluded in 1923. So the South Platte River Compact is 100 years old this year. That was between just Colorado and Nebraska. But that one is also still in the news and still in dispute because of the situation with Nebraska today. Okay, so we've talked about some legal issues, some infrastructure, some organizational things that are going on. We haven't talked about nature and the environment yet, but of course, things that naturally happen impact water in the state. So by the 1930s, we of course have the biggest and worst drought up to that time, the Dust Bowl basically. Drought recurs over the decades, still is happening. But whenever these kinds of droughts happen, whether in an isolated part of the state or across the state, it tends to get people thinking, how can we get more water? How can we secure our water supply? How can we make sure we won't run out? And so they start thinking about more water projects, more storage, more diversion, more movement of water. And so really in the mid 1930s, this got some legislation and organizations being established in the state of Colorado. Most of this, so 1937 saw the creation of legislation to enable water conservancy districts, water conservation districts, as well as the Colorado Water Conservation Board. I know all of that sounds the same to you. It's a bit hard to sort out. I'm going to leave others to sort that out for another day in your course and just keep on moving. But all of this basically was established to be able to build what is now called the Colorado Big Thompson Project, which was a huge Bureau of Reclamation project that got started in 1937. Took 20 years to actually finish and deliver water. So built by the Bureau of Reclamation and now run by the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, or Northern Water for short. And I'm sure you will be hearing more about Northern Water and the Colorado Big Thompson Project in your course, so I will leave it at that. But that was really a huge project, not only for this side of the divide that brings the water over from the west side, but it really also ties, so in more ways than one, it ties together the state in terms of water. Whatever is going on the Colorado River affects the Front Range. Whatever is going on in the Front Range affects the Colorado River Basin as well. So I like to stress that the state is tied together in that way, that the two sides aren't separate because the water is separate, and the water is actually closely associated. So into the 1940s, we get one of Colorado's most prominent legislators. And that was Wayne Aspinall, elected 1949, or began his tenure in 1949 in the House of Representatives, served for more than 20 years, and became really influential, especially in terms of Western issues and Western water. In the 1950s, he was a major sponsor of the Colorado River Storage Project. And that was basically to create storage on the Colorado River to help implement what was decided through the Colorado River Compact. A part of Colorado water history is also things that don't happen. So one thing that had been proposed in the Colorado River Storage Project Act was the creation of a dam at Echo Park on the Green River in Colorado. And by this time in the US, it's post-World War II, there's more prosperity in the country, there's more mobility, people getting outside more. So this is the time when the environmental era, so to speak, was really getting going. So people were paying more attention to nature and natural issues, environmental issues. And a group of, basically a grassroots group, citizens, found out about this and they fought it. They tried to prevent a dam from being built as part of the Colorado River Storage Project, to preserve the environment, to preserve this special place. And they were effective. That they succeeded in preventing this dam from being built. There was a compromise, however, and to shorten the story, that's why we have Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River, but not Echo Park Dam. And here locally, so I mentioned the beginning kind of the environmental era and grassroots organizations who are really advocating for nature and the environment and the rivers. So here in the Poudre Basin especially, I'm sure you've heard of Save the Poudre. So to me, that's an outgrowth of that environmental era, working to advocate for and preserve the environment related to the Poudre River. But they're actually one of the latest incarnations of that trend. There have been earlier groups along those same lines called the Friends of the Poudre, Preserve Our Poudre. So Save the Poudre is just the latest incarnation. People, organizations, grassroots groups have been doing this kind of advocacy work for easily 30, 40, 50 years, especially for the Poudre. One of the other outgrowths of that kind of work has been 2 special designations for the Poudre River. One being the wild and scenic designation on the upper portion of the river, and then the national heritage area on the lower portion of the river. So very unique in our state, and very special designations for what happens to be our local river here. Now, when we talk about Colorado water history, we often focus on the surface water, the rivers, the streams, even the snowpack and the precipitation. But we don't want to leave out groundwater. Groundwater is also an important source of our water supply in Colorado. And it was only in 1965 that they really figured out effectively how to incorporate groundwater rights into the surface water rights system. So it took a while, but I also like to point out that Colorado was ahead of other states in doing so. So it gets complicated, but by the 1960s, they had worked this out. There's still some issues in the system, but here locally in 2002, during that drought, the biggest impact for groundwater here was that the state engineer's office shut down hundreds of wells because of the drought, because of water rights issues, and that impacted agriculture significantly in this region. So a big impact in 2002 from that. And then most recently, some interesting groundwater history going on currently is that the city of Greeley has a project called the Terry Ranch Project. So if you're not heard about this, where they have, it seems to be an innovative project to bring, to move, to store groundwater for municipal use. So that looks like it's going to be some interesting work going on there. And so back to natural disasters. So 1976, one of the worst flood events in Colorado was the Big Thompson flood of that year. It also affected the Poudre River as well, but in particular, the Big Thompson River. More than 144 people died, millions of dollars in damage, but also lessons learned from that flood event. If you've been in the canyon and seen any of the signs that say, in case of flood, climb to safety, they seem minor, but that's actually something that came out of this flood because when the river's rising, you're trapped in your car. People at the time didn't know what to do. So that was one of the lessons learned, that we need to direct people, especially if they've never been here before. If the tourists driving through, something's happening, climb, get out of your car. Don't think of that as something protective. So that's, again, just one example of something that was learned from that flood. And of course, if you've been around the area for a while, you might have experienced the 1997 Spring Creek flood here in Fort Collins. And then, of course, this week, we are commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the 2013 floods that, again, hit a wide part of the Front Range region. But again, lessons learned from some of those, to me, it seemed that for the 2013 floods, at least here in Fort Collins, some of those earlier lessons from 1976, from 1997, in terms of infrastructure and some mitigation actions, actually did help prevent damage within Fort Collins. So not great to have floods, but we can get some lessons out of those. I'd like to include our Native American friends when I talk about Colorado water history. There are two tribes in the state of Colorado, the Ute Mountain Ute and the Southern Ute. All the tribes in the U.S. were guaranteed water rights under the 1908 Supreme Court decision for Winters v. United States. In Colorado here, it was 1988 when those water rights were settled. So it took a while, but it happened here for those tribes in 1988. In other states, especially in the Colorado River Basin, they still are working out settlements for water rights. And then want to include some wildlife as well. There are, of course, endangered species issues across the state. This one that I'm highlighting is related to the Platte River. So 1994, the states of Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming came together with the U.S. Department of the Interior to implement some parts of the Endangered Species Act for the Platte River. Again, negotiations took decades to work this out and get it actually implemented. But this is also often referred to as three birds and a fish. Those were the species involved, the fish being the pallid sturgeon, the birds being whooping cranes, the least tern, and the piping plover. So it can be thought of as a new use for water. Traditional uses being agriculture, municipal, and industrial, and this basically was an environmental use of water, of leaving it in the stream for the benefit of nature, basically. There are plenty of other ways that has been done in Colorado, but just to mention one here. And then our last stop on this whirlwind timeline is 2005, when the state created, or their state legislation passed Bill 1177 that created the interbasin roundtable. Yes, the interbasin roundtables, the basin roundtables and the interbasin compact committee for the state. So basically the major river basins all had roundtables established, and this was to help them communicate, help them understand the different interests, the different needs, the different challenges going on in any given basin, to figure things out, help reach solutions, and then feeding up to the state level an interbasin compact committee. So the person who had this idea, who got this going, his name was Russ George, and he was really basing his idea on Delph Carpenter's concept of interbasin river compacts. So it has generated quite a bit of discussion and communication in the state and across, within basins and across basins as well. So, like I said, there's been plenty more history, but last stop for today. And of course, the history of Colorado water continues. But hopefully you've seen the challenges that have been presented, as well as some of the solutions and collaborations that have come out of some of these issues. I will stop there.
Thank you, Patty. And as we kind of open up this time, we have about 10 minutes for discussion before we get some lunch. I want you to think of not just what you heard from John and Patty, but also what you saw in the Great Divide movie, and thinking about some of those questions that you had, or some of the key takeaways that you had from that movie, what you learned here today, and kind of continuing that conversation as we bring in this discussion. I do want to get back to your question, David, but I'm going to open it up for comments, questions, anything you want to dive into here.
We got two very knowledgeable people here, as you can imagine. That's who you got to see, so. Don't be shy. Well, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, you ready for it?
Yeah, so, the question is like, okay. Why is Colorado having such a surcharge just simply for the raw water for housing along the Front Range? Because that doesn't exist if you go out to Akron, for example. It doesn't exist in Grand Junction. It's really a Front Range phenomenon that is really pretty much from Colorado Springs up to Fort Collins. That's what I say, along I-25 spine. Okay, so when you really get down to it, there's this sort of coalescing of many different many different policies going on, many different government scales that are creating this problem. And one of the first ones is Colorado's water management is highly balkanized. And just to give you an idea, it's like if you try to map out how does water make it from the West Slope and the Colorado Big Thompson project to a user, somewhere downstream. It's like, okay, Northern Water's involved, you have reclamation involved to some degree. Then you get to the point of actually having ditch companies, canal companies, water conservancy, so forth and so on. And everyone takes their cut. They may be not-for-profits, but they take their cut. And anytime you increase the number of governmental or quasi-governmental organizations involved in actually moving water, you're increasing the cost of that. So that's one of the fundamental problems, just in comparison. When you look at the population kind of the northern Front Range, what are we, around 600,000 people now, somewhere in that range? Okay, so in Boise, Idaho, and when you looked at the Treasure Valley, this was about 10 years ago, there were about 600,000 people in the valley. If you looked about the amount of water that they moved to the valley, it was not too dissimilar to the amount of water that is moved when you start looking at, kind of northern Colorado, when we talk about the Big Thompson, the Cougar and so forth, so on. The difference is that everything in terms of the big picture of water movement in the Boise Valley was controlled by the Boise Project Board of Control and then individual ditch companies. And so when you got down to the process of like, how much did it physically cost to move the water? You paid a per use ditch fee for reclamation, which was like $6 an acre foot. And then you paid something for the ditch company that ran in terms of the property value. With a typical house, you're paying like $20 a year. And so when you look at it, just the economic efficiencies of the bureaucracy of moving water, it was way more efficient there than what exists here. The second thing is this is one I haven't been able to dive into much in Colorado, but I would like to get into at some point. When we built the house in Idaho, one of the things we learned was to get a mortgage, you actually have to get a certificate of occupancy. The final step in Idaho in certificate of occupancy was a certificate from the state health board that said you have an adequate water supply of adequate quality to live in the house. It was the weirdest thing when almost the last piece of infrastructure they built for our house was the well, which I was like, wait a minute, should you put the well in first? Should we have water? They were like, nah, there's groundwater, don't worry about it. And they were right. Okay, fine, great. But there had been circumstances where they built entire houses and then realized that their water supply was not sufficient because it had to be supplied of sufficient quality at 10 gallons per minute minimum. And up in northern Idaho, there was this incident where it's happened that created some problems. So I can tell you that in Colorado, the same thing exists. Now, I'm not sure if it's a state agency or it's a county health agency. That's what I would have to dive into. But my guess is that there's issues with certificate of occupancy that is driving water utilities to acquire water at probably a much higher quantity than is actually needed to sustain a household. And I think that's probably driving some of it. It's very complicated because it involves state permitting, it involves local building codes and ordinances and so forth and so on. And understanding how those all interrelate to why a city says we need this much water for this much population. It's kind of weird because Thornton's a great example of this when you look at the amount of water that's required. And I look at the population growth, it's like, this makes no sense to me. I mean, it is way more water than they're ever going to need for these citizens. Why aren't they going through a process of just saying, hey, we're going to put in land use restrictions so you can't have so much Kentucky bluegrass, that type of thing. And it's something that I have not been able to spend enough time diving into this in Colorado to figure that one out. But it's quite obvious that that's a mixture of local and regional and state entities. And so it sort of creates what I call an artificial demand for water. And when you have that demand, of course, it's going to start driving up prices. Then the final part, which I really wish the state water courts and the state engineering would start addressing, all Western states use some form of private appropriation method. Many elements to it. And everybody focuses on first time and first vote. But the most important phrase is with the beneficial use of water. And the states say, this is the beneficial use. For example, in Idaho, in-stream flows is not a designated beneficial use. You cannot acquire a water right for in-stream flows. State of Washington, you can't. Okay, it differs state by state. Well, okay, every Western state clearly states that speculation is not a beneficial use. It clearly states you're not allowed to acquire water rights for speculation. Yet you can go through and you can start looking at this. Cities are allowed to acquire water rights for future projected growth. And you can start playing fast and loose with the rules on that when you look out and say, well, you know, we get to use a 30-year growth horizon, we get to use a 50-year growth horizon, we get to use whatever. And so you get into situations where there's entities that will work to acquire water rights that they're not going to use for many decades. An example is Thornton. They started acquiring these water rights 4 decades ago. And they use future growth as their beneficial use, which is allowed. But you get into this question of like, okay, they have this water rights. It's on the books. It's an asset for them. And when you start looking at the whole picture of finance with municipalities and these other quasi-governmental entities, and you start working your way through this stuff, you start beginning to go, I wonder what that asset is valued as. And then it brings into mind the real question is like, is this speculation or is this really a beneficial use for future growth? And I think that's one that maybe there needs to be a little more time spent in Colorado cracking down on this, because when you start looking at these communities that are competing for all of this water that is going to be converted from ag into municipal use, you got to start asking the question is like, are you really going to use this for future growth demand, or are you using this because you think the value of this water is going to grow? And then when you don't use it, you can sell it at a much higher inflated price. And again, that gets very complicated, but I think there needs, it's not something that I would ever think that the state engineer would take into a court of law, but it is something that I think just firing a warning shot across the bow, we're going to pay more attention to this to start tampering with that. The final thing that drives this is more of a Colorado social perspective that drives me crazy. It says it right in the Colorado Water Plan. It's just like, we're going to support urban growth, but preserve our irrigated agricultural heritage. No, you've got a choice to make. I've lived in Reno, Nevada. There were a 5th generation farmer that said, yeah, the social contract we have with everybody is we live the hard scrabble life, making irrigated ag work in Nevada, and then eventually the cities would grow and they'd make us millionaires. It was just like, it was in the mindset there that we did this for a whole variety of reasons, but in the end, we get our payout and we're happy with that. In Boise, converting ag land to cities, big deal. They actually have a way to keep the irrigation district companies whole in that whole process. It's just like, it's just not a thing. It's just like, well, we're going to grow and this is going to happen and you just deal with it. In Colorado, this mindset of we're not going to take water away from irrigated agricultural land for our cities creates, again, an artificial demand for water, which drives up the price. And that's something that is beyond the individual and municipality. This is something that is like in the state psyche. And it's like, hey, everybody, you need to grow up. This is how the rest of the West developed its population. Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, all the way down the line. And it's like, what makes you think you're so special that you're going to find out some magical way to do it? Because again, this creates this stress, which is which is driving up, some of the costs of these transactions. And so all of those things are sort of combining to create this highly inflated price for water that is going to be used for municipalities, and it's going to have to be addressed at all of those levels. But fundamentally, there's going to have to be sort of a change in the social perspective of what is the Front Range of Colorado going to look like in the East Slope 10, 20, 30, and 40 years from now. And the reality is that if they're not going to enter into serious conversations about creating local municipal rules that are really gonna reduce, the water footprint of, this increased population, then they're just gonna have to say, okay, irrigated ag's gonna go away, we gotta live with it. And, end of story. Those are the choices. And so it's kind of like a mixture of all of those that is just sort of hitting this really interesting confluence that honestly I've never seen in another Western state. They always have these conversations about wanting to keep the rural, sort of the agrarian environment. And then they kind of look at it and say, let's just build some houses and they move on. And I just, I kind of wonder what this is going to lead to, but it needs to be attacked at local, regional, and state governmental perspectives. And I think then we'll start seeing more reasonable water surcharges for housing developments in the Front Range. So just my perspective.
Building on that, or other questions, and then probably go to lunch for soon. Yeah.
Does first and time, first and right still make the most sense?
It makes the most sense if you don't stop there, because that's not what prior appropriation says. Prior appropriation says first in time, first and right, if the water is used beneficially. And some of those numbers I put up there, and I want everybody to think about this, because Colorado started to address this. But it gets into this question. It's like, okay, let's say you have a water right that says you're allowed to divert 4 acre-foot per acre you have for water. And then you saw the data up there. Our agricultural productivity's gone up, but we've used less water. How is that possible? Well, there's a couple ways to explain this. And one way to explain it is we were diverting water, really weren't paying attention. We used a lot of water flow in the canal, claimed 4 acre-foot per right, and really our crops were using 2.5 acre-foot. Was that 1.5 acre-foot being beneficially used? My answer is nope. Should that water right holder be able to claim that 1.5? It's interesting, in Colorado, they've actually got to the point of addressing this, where in some of the watersheds, they're saying, you can transfer the 2.5, but you don't get to transfer that other 1.5. But they haven't gotten to the point of saying, nah, you're not using that beneficially, you're only going to get this, and we're going to open up that other for basically the citizens of the state to claim and use. So they've sort of gone part way, but not all the way. And I think that's the problem when people start talking about first and time, first and right. They don't follow up with the other critical element, which is with the beneficial use of water, because there's a lot of water in the state over the last century that really had no beneficial use. It costs money to manage water. Why bother when it wasn't stress? And that's most water management in the West. We finally got to the point where it's like, oh, now we got to put the time and effort into management, the cost of the management. Then I think you have to revisit what are we considering in beneficial use of water, not the types, agriculture, that's all fine. But it's like when you're looking at somebody who basically just runs a free-flowing system, it doesn't really do much to try to effectively use their water. I think there needs to be some social pressure put on to say, hey, beneficial use, that requires you to work at managing your water, not just doing things the way you did for the last several decades.
So what I hear you saying there is you still think it's the best alternative, the best solution for good water.
And again, it's one of those that I always go into context. It's like, I've seen proposals out there for different ways to do this. I think it's something that exists, and it's kind of like the physical environment. Colorado has done a reasonable job of chipping around the edges. I mean, if you go in every legislative session, there always is some, small modification of Colorado water law. People's like, oh no, this is the way it's always been. It's like, well, okay, the South Platte project led to changes in 2014 on legislation addressing other elements. So there are all these refinements of it. But to get to the point of saying, we're going to adopt a riparian doctrine, which just would not work in the Western states at all, or some other system, it would be so disruptive that it's like, it's one of these things where I started talking about workplace change. You can look at it and say, we would be so much more efficient if we were going down this set of tracks. But we're going down this set of tracks and we're diverging. And the question isn't, should we be over here? The question is how much effort is going to take to build a switching track to get us here? And I just don't see it where we are in the West. I mean, it's just maybe 100 years of incremental change you get there, but it's not something you're going to change even within a decade or 2 decades. It's just impossible unless there's a crisis of such magnitude, people's very existence in the West. So I don't really enter into those discussions. I've seen the discussions, some of the theoretical papers are nice and everything. But you get into this practical questions, like how are you gonna switch tracks you're on? And it's just like, I don't see how that's possible. I do see how you start saying, well, let's realign the tracks we're going on, and figure out a little more up here, and dealing with problems as they come up. And it's the one instance where I think incremental change does work in water policy, because it would be too disruptive to sort of say, well, we're gonna toss out prior appropriations and try to do something else. And considering, the other systems that exist, I still haven't seen anything across the globe that really works in the long run that everybody ends up being happy with, so.
A quick question for Patty. First, I'll preface it by saying we could probably spend all 9 months of this class with just you two. And still not even come close to scratching the surface about your knowledge. I mean, my head's already spinning. This is strictly an opinion of yours. Okay? But with all the history you've done, with all your knowledge about historical events in water, major events in Colorado history, if you had to pick one to say, Jason, if you want to focus on the most important water event that has shaped Colorado, you could probably go all the way back to the very beginning, but what would you say is maybe the most interesting and also the most important event in Colorado water history?
I will say I will give you an answer with an opinionated answer, but to reveal my bias, within the Water Resource Archive, we hold historically important papers from individual organizations. That's what we do. And so my answer is going to be, I would highlight Duff Carpenter, and not just the Colorado River Compact, but his larger body of work, which involves the Wyoming Colorado court case, the South Platte Compact, other compacts. He was also elected to the Colorado legislature before all this, so he had legislative contributions at the state level. And there's a book about him, Silver Fox of the Rockies. We have his papers in the archives, so I'm quite familiar with him and his work. So that influences my answer. But as far as a single individual who, he wasn't any other than being a state legislator, he wasn't an elected, he wasn't governor, he didn't have that level of authority. But in terms of water leadership, in terms of innovation and ideas, and really working toward the best interest of the state, not his own personal interest, not any single basin, I think he and his body of work would be something to focus on.
Awesome, thank you.
2 more questions, then we're gonna eat lunch.
I've already asked, go ahead. Okay, I really appreciated your point about equity and inclusivity in these conversations about future water management. And I appreciate the example in Aurora. And I wondered if there are any examples of that happening in Northern Colorado, or organizations or conversations that you could point to that are already happening in Northern Colorado.
Well, I wish Jessica was here, because she'd be able to, that's that. The one that we were very recently talking about is that, I think it's the city of Fort Collins is starting to deal with the trailer park issue. And trailer parks, I mean, and this is true across most of the United States. It's like every place I've lived, trailer parks have the worst water supply and the worst wastewater treatment. I mean, in Moscow, Idaho, it was like horrendous what they were dealing with. I remember in Manhattan, Kansas was the same thing. And so it is something that the city, I believe it's the city of it's either Larimer County or the city of Fort Collins, is putting together a task force to start dealing with this and saying, okay, how do we make sure that the water supply and wastewater collection, Fort Collins, is adequate? And it's dealing with, a situation where I'm not sure of the entire demographics of who are living in these trailer parks, but that it is coming from lower economic needs. And so it's trying to deal with it. And it's sort of like, it's a good example, and there's other examples where you have pretty much things at the municipal level we're trying to deal with. And this sort of becomes my problem, is that when I look at an effort such as a state water planning effort, I think this should be something where it gives the people that actually have to be more directly associated with water users, which are all the people in Colorado, the tools to better plan for circumstances. And when you look at that and look at the state water plan, it's like, it's kind of silent on these issues. It really doesn't get into these issues of like, what are the real challenges associated with people having access to clean, potable, reliable water supplies? It sort of does these things at this big scale and always comes up with, in Colorado, it's $30 billion worth of projects and problem solved. It's like, no, that's not where the problems exist. The problems really exist in kind of these local pockets when you get into the equity discussion and thinking about, well, what tools need to be in place to really deal with this? I mean, what's going on in the city of Wellington? Again, not sure the entire demographics, but it is a population that is not as economically well off as Fort Collins. And they're just getting hammered with their water bills right now. And that's an equity situation. A lot of rural Colorado, there's abandonment of water systems because they don't have the financial mechanisms to sustain them. Again, an equity, issue. And again, the state water plan is just absolutely silent on this. And Colorado's not alone. Most state water plans do not address this. And I think they sort of need to start thinking about it as like, if we're developing a state water plan, let's think about it in terms of providing tools for communities to address these water security challenges for their population across the spectrum of sort of economic and demographic variability.
One more. All right, this is probably so unwise, but I want to push back a little bit on your comment about comparing, taking away agricultural land.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we've got to eat, right? And Weld County is the 9th most productive agricultural county in the nation. And we are hoarding our water in Weld County because we want to sustain that, and we've got a growing population that needs to eat. So, maybe it's a Colorado ethic. I don't want to look like Tucson or Reno.
Well,
Yeah, we want to be arena.
so I will give you the example of the San Luis Valley. And this is one where in my experience, because of how I've worked in water, I've been intersect a lot with the agricultural production industry. So I'll give you the example in the Texas High Plains. This is like 20 years ago, you know, what was produced in the Texas High Plains? Pretty much corn, alfalfa, feedstock for the dairies and feedlots there. They have a dairy that was 20,000 head of cattle. Before the guy screwed up with the methane production, he killed 18,000. She forced her. It was bad. They have feedlots that have 50,000 cattle in them. And you know what they grow in that region now? Cotton, because it's more water efficient. So how do they sustain these dairies? It's like, hey, feedstocks are easy to move. We start looking at the agricultural productivity, and a lot of it in most of the eastern plains of Colorado. I'm tasked with working on a project now that's talking about dealing with the Republican River Compact and what happens and everything. And there's these discussions of like, well, if we don't have ag production in that basin, you know, it's going to destroy the livestock industry in Colorado. And I'm looking at it, it's like, do you realize where most of the feedstock for the livestock comes from? It does not come from Colorado. It is imported from areas that have more water and are able to do that. So in these areas where you've seen ag land go out of production and high value ag land, there's always this presumption that our food sources are much more local than they really are. And there's always these shifts in production. And because of our unbelievable transportation system across this country, in essence, these shifts happen. You don't even know that they happen. And so you can go, you know, in example after example where there's been this heavy urbanization, and the same discussion has always come up. It's like, where are we going to get our food from? So guess what? We're getting most of our food from the Midwest. Okay, you know, the Midwest will just produce more. That's what's going to happen. And so in looking at it from a food security perspective, it's just like, it's not really going to affect our food security. And there's places across the nation, and think about this in the high plains of Texas, where again, hundreds of thousands of acres converted from food crops, corn in particular, and silage, which was used, you know, in feedstock, which directly becomes food, and it goes to cotton. Well, that's fiber production. We're not eating that. Nobody noticed. When you start looking at it, when I was a kid, you know what the most productive melon growing region in the United States was? Pecos. They ran out of water. Well, now we have Rocky Ford. Now we have melons grown in Oh, it's the Columbia River Basin, I'm trying to remember the region, it's now Walla Walla, that's where the onions are grown. But you see these shifts in ag production that happen almost invisibly to us because we're not thinking about it. When I hear the argument of like, well, California doesn't get the water, where are you gonna get your lettuce from? Guess where we're gonna get our lettuce from? Urban agriculture that's gonna exist in vertical farms in the perimeters of cities. It's already happening in Texas around Dallas. It's like these are exploding across the state. And it's just one where, yes, water is important for agriculture, but there's sort of this, this mantra says like, if you move it out, what's going to happen to the food supply? It's just going to shift. And when you look at, the unbelievable agricultural production system in this nation, we export so much. I mean, we export so much alfalfa, we export so much, feedstock, we export a tremendous amount of product. And it's just like, if it really became a stretch for us to feed ourselves, we are going to feed ourselves first rather than the world. I will guarantee you that. And there is quite a capacity to deal with it. And as long as our transportation system stays in place, it's like, yeah, we're going to be getting this stuff from all over the place. And the Colorado livestock industry, they will be, in essence, supported by crops grown in other places. In the San Luis Valley, the example there is they used to grow barley. They were the big barley suppliers for Coors Brewery. Coors went someplace else. You know what they do now? Well, alfalfa and export it to North Texas. It's just like they shift. The agricultural production community is very savvy, is a business, and they're very good at it. And I've seen this time and time again when you see these shifts occur. It's just like, yeah, as urbanization occurs, as they move out of irrigated agriculture to limited irrigation or ag production, the research is already going on. This is already happening. And it's just going to be, well, it'll be interesting to see what it leads to and what the landscape will look like. But in terms of the food production, I'm not terribly worried about that because I've seen it happen in too many places already where we just have not seen a decrease in food security.
Okay, I'm sorry, we gotta draw it too close, but we're gonna get some lunch. So we've got your lunches or a label with your name sitting out there. Please get them, bring them back in. If you wanna sit and chat a little bit, we are gonna have to start our next session pretty soon, so we get him enough time, but, go get your lunch, bring them back in here, take a short break, and then we'll get into the next presentation. And thank you, John and Patty.
All of the lunches are labeled with names, and if you didn't order one, there are some extras. There's also like a label of what's in each of them, so if you have allergies, you can read that label to make sure if you didn't order one and you need one of the extras. Oh, naturally. Yep, as it goes. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, naturally.
For the Big Thompson, or is it just not a beloved historical?
Certainly less, so.
Yeah.
This look like the right thing?
More like a.
Yeah.
Right.
Don't play. It's all right.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
We allocate more like with state.
Yes.
Right. And then if you, what's the Has it come up a couple of times?
Yep, no problem. And you'll have to use the extra keyboard. My keyboard is destroyed. Yeah, you'll just have to.
And it's one where. So this.
All this
Well.
I mean, it's like, in.
We have your meal out there. He just water. I was actually. Yes. There wasn't that many of it. Yes, right. Got everything figured out for you?
Yeah, I think so.
Sweet. This should do the magic.
So that's the fall.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
I just figured out.
I just need to do that for finance.
Yeah, no, still how you like.
So that's not.
Oh, yeah, sure.
If you can hear the sound of my voice now.
I was just thinking crisscross applesauce.
Okay. I don't know what that is.
It's a kindergarten.
Okay, unfortunately, we are, gotta keep moving on because, I wanna make sure we have plenty of time for our next speaker. So we are gonna be eating lunch, while he's giving his presentation, but hopefully we'll finish up and have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Martin Carcassonne. He's a professor in the Communication Studies Department of Colorado State University, and he's the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. His research focuses on helping local communities address wicked problems more productively through improved communication, community problem solving, and collaborative decision making. The CPD is a practical applied extension of his work and functions as an impartial resource dedicated to enhancing local democracy in northern Colorado. So has done a lot of really amazing work. Very excited to have you here today, Martin. And thank you for stepping out of your meeting early today.
Well, I had to leave a faculty meeting early. It was so painful.
Sorry, guys. Made a commitment.
Yeah, so welcome. Hopefully you're enjoying your lunch. To give you a little bit more about context, I think I've probably done this for like 5 or 6, 7 times or so. Y'all bring me in, so it's always a joy to kind of come in here. You'll get a sense as I talk through things today. I'm a big fan of programs like Water Literate Leaders in terms of how they can kind of build capacity in our communities to help us take on our shared problems a little bit more productively. So my research now for the last 20 years, I'm getting old, has been how do we talk about tough issues? My initial academic training was in the subdiscipline called argumentation, which is really how do you really analyze how people make arguments? What kind of evidence they find, what kind of logic, what kind of, or lack thereof, the fallacies, or but also kind of looking at the power of stories, the power of narratives, the power of emotions. And particularly a lot of my work, as you'll see today, is how we talk about values and how values can be used to divide us and really distract us from issues. And values, when we know how to really talk about it more productively, can really help us kind of shift and have some tough kind of conversation. My early work was much more national politics, and I got more and more frustrated with the national kind of two-party system that you'll get a sense as we kind of go through why, right? Now I'm pretty much a process person. I design processes really to avoid triggering the worst of human nature and tap into the best of human nature to help us work on our shared problems. And unfortunately, national politics often does the opposite. It's really good at triggering the worst of human nature and rarely tapping into the best. So I shifted my work from national to local. And I shifted, initially I was more of an academic, kind of like the term of the rhetorical critic. I would comment on other people's communication, particularly presidential speeches. So I shifted from being a critic to much more of a practitioner in terms of using a lot of this research that we know from my field, from conflict management, from collaborative work, a lot of social psychology, kind of brain science, to then, okay, now I serve this impartial role to help people have better conversation with it. So partly what I'm here is to kind of cover some of that material, why it's so hard to have good conversations, and how we can kind of start developing both individual and kind of organizational and hopefully community capacity to have better conversations. Because once we do that, one of my overall arguments is when we're so hyper polarized like we are right now in our politics, it makes us hard to deal with any issue, right? It just, erodes trust in each other, in our institutions. It erodes trust, information doesn't work the way we want it to work when we're kind of polarized. We'll get into that a little bit. And we just spend all our energy kind of attacking the other side versus actually addressing the problem. So my work is working, trying to just shift that in some ways. The good news is if we can take on that polarization or build, at least in our local communities, as kind of inoculate us against some of those, then we'll have positive impact on all the kind of issues. And clearly water is one of the big issues that we deal with in Northern Colorado and the West, that we need really hard, tough conversations and processes to figure out the best way to kind of move forward on these issues, right? So one thing I'm going to do, I also hope, and this has often been the case with this group, that this is the beginning of a conversation, right? I don't know how many, anyone already heard me talk before on these issues? A few people are come to CBD events. CBD runs a lot of events in the community for the city of Fort Collins University. I did bring kind of a copy of most of my slides. A lot of my slides like slowly build, so they're kind of safe paper. It's just the final slide. When I'm listening to a presentation, I always want someone's slides there, right? I want to be able to argue with them and write comments and so forth. You also on that first slide have my email, so. I'm going to cover a lot of material kind of quickly, just kind of give you a sense of things, but I'm happy to kind of talk more about this and kind of send you some resources. And also, hopefully I'll live this out. Basically some intellectual humility here, right? I don't pretend to have it all figured out. We've got 18 years of experience running meetings going pretty well, but I'm always learning new things, and it's very interdisciplinary. So there's people that certainly have expertise in the room and other parts that I'm happy to kind of think about, right? But I wanted to start with a quick little poll just to kind of see where. So I'm going to pass this out. Actually, I can do this. To me, normally I use my computer, but it's hard to do now. So if you got your smartphone or if you're on a laptop, pass some of those out. I'm going to use poll everywhere. It's just kind of on your phone. You just do the QR code, or you can kind of put in the website. And it's got a question up there to kind of start us off thinking, and we'll react to a little bit. Right when you pull it up, it'll ask for your name, but right under the box for names is skip. So I don't need your name, so you can kind of skip that and kind of be anonymous in a sense. Why is that not showing up there? Okay. I've been asking this question maybe for like the last 6 years or so with quite a few groups. So we'll see the results kind of coming in here once we kind of get on there. I'm assuming it's working. Yeah. People are voting, right? Yep. All right, let me see. Okay, I can see it on mine. I guess it's not, normally it updates on the website, but it's all right. Let's get, I can. All right, so I got special software on my computer that kind of embeds it, but I can kind of show you. You can see up here, right now, dominated by a few loud voices has 16 votes. Polarized has 15. Third is mean spirited, which has 8. Fourth is weak and limited, people are apathetic, that has 7. One person has picked dominated by expert. No one has picked high quality informed. No one has picked robust, right? Oh, 3 have picked simplistic. Can you confirm basically like, all those numbers?
Yeah,
Right.
correct.
So I'm not hiding these for you from you to make a point. But that's the point I am making. You had options of positive terms and negative terms. You get to pick up to 3. As I've been doing this last 5 years, this is actually the most typical thing I get, right? That almost always, I think one time something positive kind of made it into the top 4 or 5, right? But almost all the negative ones get picked before any of the positive ones. And then a few times with this, smaller groups like this, not a single person picked a top positive term. That's a problem, right? Because one thing that's just a reality is democracy requires pretty high quality communication, right? We have to be able to talk to each other. And we don't have that ability, particularly on the national level. If I ask this nationally versus locally, we might get some different answers, right? So I realize the problem's a lot more at the national level, but we're also seeing it kind of filter down more and more at the local level. The strategies that are working at the national level, particularly designed to kind of divide us and outrage us and so forth, we're starting to see a little bit more at the local level. That's one thing that I think we need to work against because that's a problematic thing. So one way to think about it is, they don't see the results on here, but my work is kind of 2 steps. One is how do we change how we engage each other to start avoiding some of the negative terms, right? How can we avoid the mean-spirited, the polarized, the simplistic, right? And the dominated by a few loud voices. That's the first step. Right now, we're actually doing a lot of things that incentivizes those, right? If we stop doing bad process, that will help us. If we replace bad process with good process, then we can actually start getting some of those positive terms. And if we build capacity in our communities to have these kind of tough conversations, that's going to be a capacity of power that will relate to lots of different issues. So I'm going to try to cover today, well, this is just a quick slide to show you that I'm not the ivory tower academic coming down to try to tell y'all how to talk and think, right? Almost everything I'm talking about today is from stuff in the community. Right? We've run over 500 meetings in the last 18 years since I started the CBD in 2006. So these are just some of the issues that we've dealt with. Every single one of these primarily has been the community coming to us and saying, hey, we'd love to be able to talk about this issue better. Can you help us? And I'll talk a little bit at the end exactly kind of what we do. But you'll be kind of doing it in some ways here. Right? So I'm going to try to cover 2 quick questions in the next hour or so. So first is, why are we so polarized? How do we understand how our brains are wired and how social psychology works, and why that helps explain kind of why we're so angry and polarized right now, which is undermining our ability to work together, and then what can we do about it? So I spent, this is now, I guess, 6, 7 years ago, I did a deep dive for about 2 years into the research on brain science and social psychology, just to understand how we're wired. Partly because there's a lot of cool new tools to do that. We can actually watch people's brains while they're doing things and see what parts light up. And we can give them something to read on the screen, and we can see how long their eyes are looking at, how long do they look at a specific argument and so forth. So we're learning a lot of new things that we've never learned before. Unfortunately, most of it's bad news. As the more we learn about our brain and social psychology, the more we realize that we are pretty much wired for polarization and outrage in lots of different ways. We're not much more than we are for collaboration and deliberation. So if we want to get the kind of conversations I'll be arguing that we need to have, we need to kind of build up different habits individually, but also kind of build capacities and rely on things. I will say that's a little self-serving, so I'm saying basically you need facilitators, and I happen to be a facilitator, right? But I'll be explicit about that. These are just some of the books I read, if you're kind of curious. This one actually won a Nobel Prize, Thinking Fast and Slow. And argues that most people want to think fast, right? Where the term they use I love is cognitive misers, right? We're lazy. We don't want to think, we don't have to think, right? So we'd rather just kind of use simple rules or assumptions and go. But we have the ability to think slow in certain situations. We can switch from system 1 to system 2. Right? So that part of it from a process design is like, okay, how do we, when we need to, switch people from system to the better system to think slow when we need them to, right? You're not smart in 46 other ways. You're losing yourself. How your brain distorts and deceives. You see the negative theme here as people study our brain. What makes your brain happy and why you should do the opposite. It's one of my favorite title. Jonathan Haidt's work does a really good job of thinking about how conservatives and progressives think differently and what moral foundations they kind of go back to. He's got some great TED Talks about this. This is kind of a classic work. I think it was initially published in the mid-90s about why misinformation continues to kind of survive, even though all the research shows that we're wrong, right? I work a lot with city managers. When I make that point, you see a lot of them, yeah, they just know how often, like, these things don't die anyway, right? So how we know what isn't so, again, the polarization really undermines our ability to have good data and allow data to help us make better decisions. Nichols' work on the desk with expertise. One thing I've always been interested in my work is this ongoing tension between democracy and expertise, something you'll explore here kind of inherently, right? I'm very pro-expert, but I also see limitations of expertise, right? If we're going to be a democracy, we can't just let the experts make the decisions for us, and we'll get into that a little bit later, right? So it's always this process of how do we find the right balance between that? If either of those sides are too powerful, democracy or expertise, we're in trouble. We need to kind of maintain a healthy tension between them as we kind of go through. And this is the last, this is a pretty newer book, but I pulled this up for a specific kind of point. He talks a lot, he uses the phrase my side thinking. A lot of y'all probably heard of confirmation bias, right? One of our basic biases is we're biased towards our position, right? So we're really soft on arguments we agree with and really hard on arguments that challenge us, kind of natural, right? He actually makes a distinction between my side and confirmation bias, but we won't dive into detail. They're similar. But one key point that he makes that I want to point out is for most biases, the smarter you are and the more educated you are, the more likely you are to control the bias, except for my side bias. For my side bias, the smarter you are, the more educated you are, the better you are at finding arguments that support your perspective and attacking arguments that don't. So this bias isn't, oh, uneducated people are so easily manipulated. Some of the smartest, most credentialed people in the world might have made a decision 20 years ago of what they believe is true, and they've spent 20 years confirming it, right, and seeing the world through that lens. So this is, a tough thing to kind of deal with, right? So from all of that research, if this next 20 minutes or so is particularly interesting to you, I've got like a 60-page report. That's now 6 years old, right? I've got a folder about this thick to update it, to kind of go back. But I'm happy to share that by email if you want to kind of dig into the weeds. Those are just the books, and then a couple hundred academic articles that we go into. But here are the negative things. So first, we crave certainty and consistency, which I already kind of mentioned, the confirmation bias, my side bias. Once we make a decision, our brain works to defend that decision and protect that decision. Second, we're suckers for the good versus evil narrative. Right? This is kind of an anthropological fact across all cultures, across all time, that humans think in terms of story, in terms of narrative. And our favorite story is the simple good versus evil story, which obviously our side's the good and their side's the evil, right? We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And once we decide who's playing what character, we see the world through that lens. So villains do evil things and heroes do heroic things, right? We make assumptions about motives. And we're gonna go back to that over and over and over. Because a big part of what divides us is the assumptions that we make about motives, both about our side and about the other side, which undermines our ability to actually look at the reasons and the arguments and the communication we're actually doing, right? This is a group of Disney villains. Right? I've got 3 kiddos. I've watched lots of Disney movies. They've changed a little bit lately, and a Disney movie is just a plain good versus evil, right? A dark villain. Normally the villain's winning in the middle, so we get really anxious, but then good makes a comeback, and good vanquishes evil, and we live happily ever after, right? And we're giving our brain exactly what it wants. We're also training our kids that problems are pretty simple. You just have to find the villain, right? And all you have to do is vanquish the villain and the problem kind of goes away. And that will come back around here. Right? Third is that we're groupish. We hear a lot about tribal, right? So political tribes and so forth. That's a little bit more complicated term, but I like Jonathan Haidt's term of groupish. Partly because it clarifies is that we're not selfish. As a species, we're actually not that individualistic, right? We're very groupish. We're designed to be in teams. We're designed to be social. Right? This is huge. Some of the worst things humans have ever done is because of this, right? We're uniquely kind of have this ability to kind of decide the us and the them and dehumanize the them and justify the atrocities of them. One of the books I'm reading now about this is called Making Monsters, right? And it's how humans just have this ability to kind of create monsters. So how we kind of identify and what's our group and those type of things just have huge impacts on how we think and how we engage. There's some good news to this. There's another side of this coin of the power of us that we can tap into, particularly at local levels, right? Part of my switching from national politics to local politics is switching from where there's kind of two teams, a red team and a blue team, to, hey, maybe the team's Fort Collins, maybe the team's Northern Colorado, right? And maybe that's the primary identity, and you're tapping into the pro-social aspects of that versus them, right? Or maybe at least maybe the then is Boulder, which we don't want to be, right? But we're not talking about, we're not dealing with Boulder. We use that to kind of bring us together, right? We've lost that international, right? And then third, and these all kind of lead down to what's most important to me from my background, is because of those first three things, we're really good at filtering and cherry picking evidence, right? And everyone's probably heard cherry pick, right? You know what that is. Just pick the argument that fits yours. Has anyone heard the new term is nut picking? Right? The internet's really good at nut picking, right? That's an example of the people you disagree with, right? And then sending that to all your friends, right? And it might be out of context, or it might be someone with 4 followers, right? But they say something really stupid. And you're like, this is what all they think, right? So our brain is kind of wired. We always compare like the best example of our side versus the worst example of their side. Therefore, clearly, we're correct, right? So this one's so important to me. I kind of dug into this quite a bit in my report. Kind of building the stages of motivated reasoning. So it's kind of chronological, these biases we get into. The idea of motivated reasoning is this idea, we're motivated to think in a certain way. We like to think that we're motivated for accuracy or for truth, but primarily we're motivated to protect our team, right? To defend the decisions that we've already made. Right? So when I developed this 6-7 years ago, most of these terms on the right were pretty new to me. Then the 2016 presidential election was kind of motivated reasoning on steroids, right? So I think a lot of these terms we're starting to adapt to this reality and kind of how do we learn about these? How do we teach people about these, right? And control this. And that's the good news. Is the bad news is our brains are wired for these things are really easy to trigger. The good news is the more we understand that, the less power they have. There is an inoculation effect that once you know that your brain wants these simple stories, when you're like buying into a simple story, hopefully a light goes off saying, well, maybe you're missing something, right? Though I know using the metaphor of inoculate is not the greatest thing to talk about misinformation these days, right? So we'll follow there. Right? So the first stage is we're biased on what information gets to our heads, right? What news channel are we watching? Who are we having conversation with, and engaged? Selective exposure, echo chambers, filter media levels. Even if you don't do this consciously, right? Even if you constantly try not to do it, your computer's doing it for you, right? With these algorithms. If you're using your home computer and you search something and you tend to pick the conservative link or the progressive link, it learns, it likes conservative progressive stuff. So then to make your search more efficient, it's giving you exactly what you want, right? Basically, we're learning more and more about social media, right? That social media is taking these negative quirks of human nature of wanting to kind of be right and amplifying them. They're doing it for us in some scary ways, right? Probably the most important, which kind of gets that confirmation bias on my side, is how we interpret the evidence. So we're biased on what gets to our ears, and then we're biased on how we make sense of that and how we judge it. One of the paragraphs that's kind of haunted me now for the last 6 years. So this is from Jonathan Haidt's book, but kind of paraphrasing Tom Gilliland's book, but basically kind of explain when we want to believe something, the question we ask is, can I believe this? And our rules of evidence are pretty easy, right? Just one good example or evidence, like we're done, we can stop thinking, like Costanza, right? Whereas if we don't want to believe something, the question we ask is, must I believe this? And the rules of evidence are flipped. Now we just need one example that just confirms it, right? And that allows us to, and that's huge, right? Because, for example, maybe you have one good example in your, maybe not even a good example, but a convincing example to you of the media being biased against your side, right? You can use that one example to dismiss anything the media says you don't like, right? Because you can go back to that one example. So I'm one of those people, while I'm impartial, resource, obviously I have my own kind of political beliefs. I get really angry with the people on my side when they make bad arguments, right? More than with the people that disagree with me, because I know those bad arguments are gonna make it easier for the other side to dismiss things, right? Or when we, don't do good science, or when we exaggerate things, right? So we know that's setting up, and then that mistake is gonna come back on us second or third time. One here that I'll get into, because I know you'll be able to, this is unique because you'll have a lot of science, a lot of information, right? You're gonna be mixing kind of the public values and concerns and expertise really well in this program. But one of the things that we're learning, and this still new, but some of the research that comes up with this notion of and basically the argument is, in some cases they found, say if I'm trying to convince you you're wrong, right? In some cases they found that the stronger my argument, right? That the clearer the research, the better the sources, the clearer the logic, the more you might backfire, right? Because if we're polarized, she is laser focused on finding something wrong with my argument, and she'll find it, right? If you're looking for it, she'll find it. And at the end of the exchange, she'll be thinking, oh, your big bad PhD brought all this research, and I still blew him out of the water. Right? But the reality is there's some evidence, again, it's a little back and forth and still learning, that information is not going to save us. Data is not going to save us. In a lot of cases, when we're polarized, throwing information at the other side is likely just to bounce off, or again, might even backfire more. I'm not saying give up on facts. I'm not saying science doesn't matter. I'm saying when we're hyper-polarized and we're like this, it doesn't work. So we have to change the conversation. That's a lot of my work, is how do we change the conversation so then the data matters again, right? A lot of my work early on has been, how do you make a distinction between a strong argument and a weak argument? And we kind of lose that when we're polarized. It doesn't matter if it's a strong argument or weak argument. It just matters if your side likes it, right? And that's what gets rewarded. But as we elevate our conversations and we get away from this, it gets back to, hey, strong arguments should be elevated, weak arguments should be exposed. So if you're sure your side has the better arguments, screaming about it's not going to help, right? Improving the conversation is what's probably long to be an impact. Last one, I'll go quick of how we make attributions. So we remember information in terms of story, right? We kind of put it, create a story in our head. That's one way to think about all this is, our brains are really, really good at getting any new information to fit within our existing narrative, rather than allow new information to challenge that. So that's why, if you're still on social media and you haven't unfriended anyone who disagrees with you after some of the campaigns, right? Like an event will happen and you're like so sure, like this will be the one thing that will finally break through. And then they somehow logically show how that event just supports their position, right? How do they do that? Because that's how our brains are wired, that we're really good at doing that. This is George Bush after the Dallas police officers were ambushed about 5 or 6 years ago. He actually captured the research pretty well. Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. They get assumptions about motives. One thing I'll tell you for sure, political pundits and media love to do this. Whenever someone on one side is telling you what the other side truly is trying to do, completely ignore it, right? That's not the motives, right? That's what's so easy to trigger. And then how we make decisions, so we have these biases, and even what we remember. We're really good at remembering those anecdotes that fit our narrative and kind of pigeonholing those that challenge us. Right? This fifth one, that our brains are just really bad at valuing on those tensions and tough choices. We don't like paradoxes. That's setting something up, because my argument is going to be the best way to have tough conversations is to lean into the tensions. Right, and to think about things really differently. Right? So that's kind of the individual social psychology, why we tend to have blinders on. And then now we move on to the social psychology, people with blinders on, trying to have interactions with people with other blinders on, and it doesn't go so well, right? So I call this the vicious cycle of exaggerated polarization. So vicious cycle is a negative feedback loop. And unfortunately, polarization leads to more polarization, which leads to more distrust, leads to polarity. So it is kind of a going cycle. The good news is my last cycle talks about the virtuous cycle of authentic engagement. So we are finding ways of turning this cycle around. Right? A little bit of good news is this: we're not nearly as polarized as we think. Right? Some of the polls pretty scary, right? In some ways more polarized than we've ever been, and we've had a civil war, right? But a lot of that is fake. A lot of that is manufactured, right? A lot of people are getting really rich, polarizing us in some ways. So having won 500 meetings in these last 18 years, some on some pretty tough issues, it doesn't take much for people at a table to kind of make us feel like, oh, realize, like, you're not nearly as evil as I thought you were. But the problem is, the perception of polarization is more important than the actual polarization. If we think we're polarized, we're going to act that way, right? But the good news is it should be pretty easy to expose and undo with good process. We started with the individual develops their prejudice bias, what I was just talking about. Then we get into negative interaction effects, which again is we're interacting with different people. Catherine Schultz has a whole research, a great book on, what do we do when people tell us we're wrong? Short version, not well. Right? If you like TED Talks, she's got a great TED Talk kind of summarizing this. But she talks about these 3 stages that we go through, right? So if you think I'm wrong, right? I'll pick on you this time. If you think I'm wrong, first step is you'll just assume I'm ignorant, right? Ignorant seems kind of a nasty word, but just means unaware, right? I just don't know what he knows, right? So then what do? You educate me, right? New information, but I don't change my mind. So then you have to update the idiot assumption. Right? So the idiot assumption, okay, now he knows, he's just not smart enough to understand the implications of why this data was so critical and why you should have changed it, right? And you can stay there for quite a while, right? But maybe you interact with me in other ways, and you're thinking, he seems so bright other than this politics thing, right? So she argues eventually we go to the evil assumption. It's a big jump and a bad word, right? But mainly it goes back to motives. His brain is actually telling him he knows I'm right, but he refuses to admit it because he has some ulterior motive. Right? Well, once you make that decision, once you make the decision that the people that you just agree with are bad faith actors that are not playing by the rules, there's no reason to talk to them. Why converse? They're refusing to yield to the force of the greater argument, right? So don't bother with them anymore. Well, living together in democracy, it's pretty tough for half the population not to ever bother talking to the other half of the population, right? So it's been a pretty tough situation. Then we have something what I call the Russell effect, which is from this internet meme from Bertrand Russell. Like most internet memes, it didn't exactly say that, but pretty close. It's actually a combination of 3 different things. If you're interested, my paper kind of goes through the history of it. Some of this is from the poet Yeats. Sometimes people kind of like, didn't Yeats say that? But the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts. One of the reasons we seem so exaggerated is because the loudest voices are often the most exaggerated. And that makes sense. If I know I'm right and they're evil, I need to be really loud, right? And I'm going to be I'm going to be at that microphone at City Council. I'm going to be active on Facebook, and I'm going to have bumper stickers, right? But if you see the tension in an issue, right? You see kind of both. There's not really a place for you to talk in those places. We reward confidence. We reward certainty. We don't reward that seems weak. You don't have a position and so forth. But the reality, as we'll get into a little bit, is the best way to look at issues from my perspective is to see them as these complex issues that we have to negotiate these tensions. That's not natural to our brain, and that's not what is rewarded out there in public. Right? So then you look at our institutions. So the internet, which in so many ways is wonderful, and once you understand those negative quirks of human nature, the internet is really good at just making them worse, right? Makes it so easy to find like-minded people, so easy to nitpick and to cherry pick and find. There's so much information out there now, right? For information that fits your perspective, it's pretty easy to do. Right? It's funny, as I started doing this, one of the, some of the classes I've always taught back in the grad school has been like public speaking classes and persuasion classes where they have to come into a campaign, or an argumentation debate class, right, that they have to pick. And I realized for most of those classes, they would, at the beginning of the class, they would pick their argument, right? Or they'd be assigned to the yes side or the no side, and sometimes had to flip, right? And then go find evidence. Well, our brain is really good at that, right? I've already made the decision. Now let me go find evidence that I'm right, right? And there's so much information out there, we'll do it, right? So now I've changed all my classes. Instead of like starting with pick a side and go find evidence for it, it's like, hey, pick a good question and go actually, true inquiry, try to find the answer to that question. The other quick thing about that class is, all semester long, we'd have groups of 4, pick an issue. We required it to be yes/no issue, which now is a horrible idea, right? Because 2 would be yes and 2 would be no, right? And they would research it like crazy and do evidence card and a whole long brief of evidence and research. And then they'd have a debate, and then we'd switch sides and debate again, and the semester would be over, right? And then I realized after I'm going through this, is like, we had 2 committed to yes, 2 committed to no. No one looking for compromise. No one looking for innovation, no one looking for new ideas, no one looking to transcend the tensions, right? And again, all they were doing is looking, they decided to write. So it was just kind of this spectacle. And the worst thing is the same team would often win, right? So when they were yes, they would win, and when they were no, they would win, because they were just better debaters, right? So then we were just teaching the kids, facts don't matter, it's just your skill, and so yeah, we changed that class a little bit. And then you get to our overly adversarial political system. I won't go through all these bullet points, but this is why I left. I fled national politics to come to local. But the summary of all this is we have a national political system that tends to reward bad argument and punish good arguments. And the issues that we're dealing with are hard enough already without that kind of awkward game layer on top of it. Yeah, so then, in my report, I kind of looked at, okay, how do we engage people? How do we get people talking about issues? Both, from national levels of elections. I mean, I love elections for democracy's sake, right? But from a communication perspective, elections are horrible, right? Because elections, you just have to kind of win a plurality. You're primarily speaking to kind of your side by saying bad things and horribles. It incentivizes really bad arguments. What it takes to win an election versus solve a problem are 2 completely different things. But so much of our culture is focused on election. But then even going down, because most of our engagement processes are, a public hearing, a one at a time at a microphone type of thing. We have all these ways for people to express their individual opinion, and very few ways for people to actually engage each other productively. And as you see, people's individual opinions can sometimes be problematic because the blinders on and kind of how. So if you have a long line in city council, people are just kind of talking past each other for reality. So the problem with most of our engagement processes, we engage the public too late if it's a yes/no issue, right? I tell when I'm working with city managers and superintendents and so forth, like if your primary engagement is so late in the process that all they can say is yes or no to a specific policy, they've decided that before they walked in, right? They're there to protect their perspective and hopefully win people over, which means they're not there to think, they're not there to problem solve, they're not there to be creative, right? So it's going to be a bad process. So how do we kind of back that up a little bit? Most of our process is just provide opportunity kind of through voice, not engagement or learning. It caters to entrenched voices in a lot of ways, and a big part of what I'll talk about a lot is most of our public process. We have a lot of public input processes, right? Public voice processes, very little actual engagement or learning processes. I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important. And then the last one is the media. Unfortunately, the media loves conflict. They know the social psychology. They know if it bleeds, it leads. They know conflict is much more interesting than collaboration. Sometimes when some of our issues kind of show up, Denver news station or whatever with their cameras. And then once they realize, wait, we're not going to get that good kind of video of people like yelling at each other and spitting on each other accidentally because they're, no, they're, at tables talking to an issue and then leave, right? Because they know that that's not going to draw people. So this is this negative feedback loop. And it leads to some pretty bad things, right? Leads to where we are, at least on national politics and getting more and more below it. So the anecdote wars, the politics is just finding these stories that we can tell, gotcha politics. The outrage industrial complex, y'all heard that one yet, right? This is just a whole kind of industry now just to make us bad, right? Because we know it works. It's almost the opposite. My work is designing processes to avoid triggering the worst accumulation and tapping into the best. There's lots of people that are doing the opposite, that know the social psychology and are feeding it to us. Right? Amanda Ripley's a journalist. It's a great article called Complicating the Narrative. She got a lot of conflict resolution training and then started working with journalists. So like, hey, journalists have to deal with conflict differently. Instead of just, hey, here's two sides and isn't this fun, right? Like, how do we actually help them address the conflict, right? But she has a term called conflict entrepreneurs. We have more and more conflict entrepreneurs that are getting rich and famous. Like a very simple narrative. Right? That leads to a mean-spiritedness and a contempt, which is pretty dangerous, right? Contempt, Arthur Brooks talks about this a lot. Contempt is this emotion that's a combination of anger and disgust. It is very corrosive to communities. This is Pew Research. Every 10 years, they do big polls on polarization, particularly kind of right versus left. So I don't know if you can see it from back there. It's 1994, 2004, 2014. Now, how it's going up. This question is whether you think people from the other party are a threat to the nation's well-being, right? Next year, we'll get the new 10-year installment of it. Where do you think it will be, right? This was 2014, right? So it's probably up here now, right? And we saw, I saw one similar thing that, yeah, it was almost in the 80s or so. That they were trying to kind of capture that same thing. That's really hard for us to have the conversations we need to have to take on our shared problem. That also kind of goes to the assumption of negative motives that I mentioned, and it sparks conspiracy theories. And I can tell you as a communication person, a collaboration person, conspiracy theories are tough, right? Because once a conspiracy theory takes hold, anything I do to push back on the conspiracy theory gets swallowed up by the conspiracy. That's exactly what's, yeah. And again, undermines our ability. And the most important of all this is we've got issues we need to talk about. We've got problems we need to engage. And we're spending so much of our energy and so much of our creativity on all this other stuff. And not taking on those issues. I should have warned you. It's a little dark in the middle, but we got some, we do know things to do about this, right? I should have also said at the beginning that there's like 3 levels that this social psychology stuff can kind of hit on you, right? So the first level, I hope I got to everybody, right? And that's what they do, right? Like the other side does these things, right? The second level is a little bit more deep. It's like, ooh, some people on my side do that, right? And then the third is really self-reflective, like, oops, I've done that. I realize I might have done it a few times, right? Now we get to the next part. That's why we're so angry. So what can we do about it, right? So we've got big steps that I'll talk about today. And a lot of my work, the long term, is how do we build capacity in our local communities for the kind of conversations and engagement we need. The first is what I call adopting the wicked problems mindset. And then the second will be changing how we engage, right? So the first one is more individual, right? How do you kind of think differently? And then the second one is, okay, how do we do things differently in our community? Because we need both of those steps, right? Because you can become a much better communicator individually, but you communicating in a completely adversarial, polarized environment won't work too well, right? So we kind of both have to change individually and then work together to change how we engage more broadly. So how many people have heard the term wicked problems? This group probably more than yours, right? So maybe a third or something else. Whole literature on this, happy to share anything you want. Actually, it's as old as me. The first article was when I was born. It was initially from like civil engineers and city planners, right? And the story that was told initially is, that they got their civil engineering degree, city planning degree, and they went to work for a city. And they found out pretty quickly the kind of problems that they were trained to solve and the kind of problems that they were asked to solve were very different. Right? So they came up with this distinction between a tame problem and a wicked problem. A tame problem could be really, really complex. I always think of Apollo 11 or Apollo 13, right? When they had to get the filter, if y'all seen that movie, the square filter to fit in the thing for the round filter, because there was different parts of the ship, right? Really, really complex. They had to have all these engineers in the room to figure out, but there was an answer, right? So with tame kind of technical problems, you want really smart people to kind of figure it out, and then you just implement the thing. But what he realizes when he's working for cities, we're constantly dealing with wicked problems. And the way they talk about wicked problems is they're inherently value-laden. They inherently connect to multiple underlying values that don't fit together very well. That you can narrow it down and kind of move the needle on one value, but it's going to have all these unintended consequences with other ones. And then different people rank those values differently, right? So it makes it harder and harder to kind of deal with. So they said we have to think differently about wicked problems. So generally, the literature kind of sees wicked problems as a category or a type of problem, right? Simple and complex and wicked is kind of one way to thought about it. I like to see it more as a lens through which to see problems. So it's like a tool in your toolkit that you'll have here in about 10 minutes, right? That, you know, if you're dealing with a tough issue, you can step back and say, if we look at this as a wicked problem, it's a conversation. And a big part of what I try to do broadly is our brains are wired to assume that problems are caused by wicked people. Bad people with bad values, right? Bad people with bad intentions, with bad motives. When we shift our thinking from assuming wicked people cause the problems, villains that we have to vanquish, to putting the wickedness in the problem, we're much more likely to avoid triggering those problematic aspects of human nature and tap into some really good ones that I'll share in a moment. So I'm not saying all problems are wicked, right? I'm not saying it's the right way to think about all problems. I think it's a pretty useful tool that really helps, right? And I'll also talk a little bit later that some problems are kind of naturally wicked. There's lots of different kind of sides. Some problems, maybe one side clearly has more evidence and better arguments than the other. There's still a pragmatic power to the wicked problems lens. Because, you know, if it's polarized and we're sure the other side's wrong, attacking them within a polarized doesn't work, right? Again, if we elevate the conversation long-term, wicked problems helps us elevate the conversation and make it more clear that your side has better arguments, right? So best way, this is funny, best way to explain this is with an example. So I'll go to example in a second. I've used this example now for 14 years after I did a project with the CSU Water Institute, the Community Foundation, way back when about water. But I purposely normally use the water slide as the example because most people don't care or think about water that much, right? So it's best to kind of explain it with something that they're not passionate about, right? Because then I'm going to help them think through it. But here it's the opposite, right? Y'all decided to spend a whole bunch of time thinking about water and you probably have already thought about it a lot, right? So it doesn't work that way, but yeah. So here's my water. I create these wicked problem slides, right? A lot of my work is making sense of the noise. We have so many ways for people to express their individual opinion. You have one time a microphone, or you know, the city will send me a survey that they got for people, or they'll send me all the emails they got on an issue, right? So I have all this data, people kind of screaming at each other, or I'll go to message boards for the newspaper, right? Which are horrible to read, right? But you know, looking at it through this lens, you can pull some useful information out there, right? What are they arguing? And partly is we want to identify misinformation and fact questions that we kind of want to engage, but we also want to get a sense of what do we care about? What are the values people are expressing, right? So I kind of go through all that stuff. For this one, we had an initial event that 300 people showed up. We had little half sheets of paper that just kind of asked them open-ended questions. Like, what concerns do you have about the Kruger River? Why is it important to you? So, right? So from that, I kind of identified these are 9 things people really cared about. And purposely framing it as a positive thing, right? So kind of best foot forward here, reasonable people can care about these 9 things. Okay? What makes it wicked, though, is these 9 things don't fit together very well. And the more we focus on some of these, inherently it'll be harder to focus on the other. So my argument is the conversation we need to have is about the tensions, about the relationships between the boxes. But we're not wired to have that conversation. We would much rather talk about one box that I care about this thing. Therefore, anyone who disagrees with me is against this good thing. You're a wicked person, right? Because that's the easier kind of thing, right? And when we go one time in the microphone, we can do that, right? Like I care about this good thing and they don't, right? And we're sure we're right. And we never actually have a conversation we need to have, right? Once you start recognizing the tensions between them, you can have a much improved conversation, a deeper, nuanced conversation. So I try to spark 3 different kind of conversations long-term about issues. The long-term is this balancing one. The long-term task before us is how do we find a better kind of balance between these things? I'm not saying each of these things are equally important, right? I'm not saying anyone can order these in any ways and it's just as good as it. No, together we have to make decisions on how to arrange these things. Right? One tough thing about wicked problems from that perspective is you never actually solve a wicked problem. We're not going to come up with the perfect way to deal with water that we implement it and it's done. It's not an issue anymore. Same thing with homelessness. Same thing with how to educate a child, right? These issues are inherently value laden with competing values that the best we can do is long-term always be kind of nimble on how we kind of balance it, right? So balancing is the long-term. Short-term, there can be a recalibrating conversation. There can be, and this is, allows for activism, right? It allows for people to say, we're really out of balance, right? Maybe one value's gotten way too powerful or one value's been left behind or, when rivers started catching fire in the 1970s, like maybe a new value we should start thinking about a little bit, right? So there's chances for people to have a really strong opinion. I just ask them to have that opinion amongst a range of values rather than framing it as only one value is relevant. Right? Anytime a conversation is dominated by one value, alarm bells go off like crazy for me. Because you're framing it as, I've got good values and the people that disagree with me, I'm defining them by what they're against, right? But that's TED Talks I love lately. Monica Guzman, who works for Braver Angels, has one like The Power of Curiosity will kind of save us. She also wrote a great book called, I never thought of it that way, but it's all about bringing people together. She describes herself as a progressive Latina with Trump parents. Right, Trump supporting parents, and her progressive friends telling her how horrible Trump supporters are. Like, those are my parents, right? So she does some good work, but she talks a lot in that TED Talk about how, you know, how we love to define people by what they're against when we disagree with them, because that releases us from having to deal with any tensions. Right? And then the last conversation, it's not always possible, right? But it's kind of the ideal is when we find ways to transcend those tensions, when we kind of create some win-wins, right? And that's what I'll touch on later. That's some of the best aspects of human nature is we're really good creative problem solvers when asked to be, when put in that situation. We don't want to though, right? We're cognitive misers. We'd much rather have a simple solution of just vanquishing evil, right? But that's when we shift from the easy assumption of wicked people to the more nuanced assumption of wicked problems, it can trigger that, right? Instead of it being me against you, I'm trying to win, now we're shoulder to shoulder working a problem. And we're actually lighting up a different part of our brain, right? It is the negative aspects of human nature, more evolved, easier to trigger, right? More natural for us. Yeah, so it's literally what I'm trying to do is like design stuff to like avoid touching that part of the brain. Like, oh, I want to light that part up, right? But luckily we're learning how to do that more and more. Here's a few more examples. I won't walk through these as much, but I'm going to talk more about them. This is what we did out at Steamboat Springs. They wanted to kind of build a local food economy. So the same ideas. We got a really good sense, did surveys, figured out what people cared about. But a lot of this is the natural tensions that come up here. Healthcare in some ways is very, very complex. But in other ways, we want those three things. But those three things don't fit together very well, right? But instead of talking about the tensions, we often pick one or two at a time and frame from that. We did this one in downtown Fort Collins and the big survey. What do you want out of downtown Fort Collins? We summarized that and we actually ran a process that we gave back. Hey, here are like what about 16, 17 values people cared about. Asked people to kind of prioritize those, rank those, share with your neighbor, kind of talk through it, what we wanted. Sustainability is a great example. Triple bottom line. Single bottom line is profit. Right? If I own a private company, like my job is to kind of deliver profits to my stockholders. Triple bottom line, looking at the clock, how many stories can I tell? This is actually, I also teach a social movements class, like protest class, and I did one year really just focused on the environmental movement and read a lot of environmental histories. And the idea of triple bottom line was actually developed by environmental activists in like the 70s. And part of the idea was, if we make this a war, right, the economy versus the environment, or capitalism versus the environment, like we're going to lose because they have a lot more money and power, right? So they decided, hey, what if we reframe it, right? And we came up with this idea of triple bottom line, right? So profit, well, let's not demonize profit, right? Let's not demonize money, right? Hey, money's fine, but let's also care about people and let's also care about the planet. Well, that's a wicked problem because all three of those are great. They just don't fit together very well, right? But triple bottom line kind of leans into that tension. How do we kind of try to, and the best bottom line is it creates that possibility for that transcendent option, right? So something like green jobs or clean energy jobs, could be good for people, could be good for the economy, and it's good for the planet. And people that are traditionally working against each other are now kind of working together. And again, that's a big shift. We're trying to shift from our adversarial mindset where all the bad stuff comes to a collaborative mindset where we can actually tap into a lot of the good stuff. Okay. We actually ran a process 5 years ago for Platte River Power Authority to decarbonize. And I remember my first meeting with them, I look at their mission statement, you won't be able to read it back there. But Platte River will safely provide reliable, environmentally responsible, and financially sustainable energy, right? All three of those are great. They don't fit together very well, right? And especially if we want environmentally responsible, it's probably going to be more expensive and not as reliable right now, right? Until we figure out batteries a lot better, right? So again, that whole process leaned into that tension, right? We want these three things. Reasonable people care about these three things. They don't fit together. How do we kind of negotiate that tension in better ways? This one's a little bit different. And unfortunately, I figured this out about a year ago. But for this one, what's different is public health is in a larger font and centered. And kind of implying from the beginning that public health has to be prioritized. By the way, COVID is not quite a wicked problem. How communities respond to COVID got wicked really quick. Right? And some of these other things are, other concerns that people are concerned about government overreach, concerned about, the mandates and those type of things. But a lot of people, since they were focused on public health, saw pushback on those things at, they just don't care about public health, or they don't care about grandma, or they're anti-science, right? Defining people by what they're against. And that undermined the conversation. And you'd like to think, even in a polarized environment, like a world pandemic would be, a common enemy to bring us together. But no, we're even able to use that as fodder to divide ourselves even more, right? The last thing I'll do, quick, so I'm not going to do the keypad again, but if you just look at kind of American values, overall, democracy itself is a wicked problem. Right? We talk about these values all the time, mostly one by one, right? Friends, I care about freedom. Anyone who disagrees with me is anti-freedom or anti-American. But in reality, there's some big tensions between these kind of big values that we rarely talk about. Right? But almost every issue I deal with, take some of these basic American values and kind of ties in some tensions. And equality is a really interesting one. It's changed so much in the last 15 years. So we talk a lot more about equity now, right? A lot of y'all probably seen like the baseball metaphor, the bicycle metaphor, comparing equality and equity, right? So equality always used to be the one that people would pick the most when I pulled them. Now a lot of people don't see equality through the lens of equity, and equality is bad. And other people kind of think equality and equity is kind of the same thing, right? Because they're mainly saying, hey, how do we have more equal society? Justice is also an interesting one because justice in some ways is a tension within itself. Right? If you take Aristotle's definition of justice as getting like exactly what you deserve, no more, no less, you actually don't maximize justice. Justice is balance, whether that's reward or punishment, right? How do you kind of find that tough balance? But we're just not wired to find balances, right? We're wired to kind of frame things in simple ways and try to maximize them. Right? I basically retrained my brain, instead of avoiding those tensions like our brains are wired to do, to look for them, to lean into them. That first meeting at a coffee shop with a new project, right? Of trying to figure out, okay, what's the heart of this issue? What are the real tensions underlying this? That we need to identify those tensions and put them on the table and help people kind of work through them. Because that's what's going to spark the kind of conversations we need and eventually kind of the actions we need to move the needle on issues. So these are just some of the tensions with those 5. Here are some of the other tensions that kind of come up again and again in different issues that we need to kind of have better conversations about. Right? So the end of the wicked problem stuff, dealing with wicked problems well, we have to have some tough conversations. We have to tap into human creativity. We need to kind of collaborate. If we go back to that first question I asked you about what words you pick about the quality of public discourse, we've got a long way to go, right? We don't have the kind of capacity individually or in our communities to have these conversations. So how do we go about building that? So the last kind of summary of the wicked problems mindset is, first, presume wicked problems, not wicked people. I'm not saying that there's not wicked people. I'm saying a few things. I'm saying there's a lot fewer wicked people than you think. Right? Half the country isn't evil, right? But I also very much know that there's very few people that self-identify as wicked. Right? And so if you tell them that you think they're wicked, they're very unlikely to become less wicked, right? So it's going to go bad, right? So there's kind of a pragmatic thing, right? If a problem is really caused by wicked people, I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter, right? Makes it easier for them to kind of, So again, changing the conversation will probably make it easier for us to deal with those people as well. Wicked problem. I'm not saying it's always wicked problems, but just start with the assumption that this is a wicked problem. Become more comfortable with uncertainty. Right? Realize your brain wants simple and kind of push yourself to kind of ask those questions. I do some leadership programs, so we talk a little bit about, traditional leaders have a strong opinion, charisma, can fire people up and kind of rally them. And that's still critical sometimes in crisis. It's critical to get elected. It's really bad once you're elected. Right? Governing is a lot harder, right? So we really need, and Water Literate Leaders is a good example of this, right? The leaders we need in the 21st century are more facilitated leaders. Their superpower is the ability to bring people together across perspectives. Their skill set is more facilitation and listening versus kind of rallying people. Right? And that's a problem, right? Our process is elect these people, and then once they're in office, we expect them to do this people, and it doesn't go on. Focus on elevating the conversation, not just winning the argument. This is, your role in this. Yes, you have opinion. I'm not saying give up that opinion. I'm not saying be completely impartial or neutral, right? But at least part of your energy is to helping people have a better conversation and asking questions. I think long-term, you have more of an impact on those issues. Particularly, you picked a side because you think all the best evidence is there, right? So you have a vested interest in elevating the conversation to make that evidence matter more. Put your energy towards identifying, engaging, and negotiating here in kitchen, so that's set forward, and then work towards creating a learning community. Since we can't solve wicked problems, the quality of our communities are going to be defined in many ways by the quality of the ongoing conversation, our ability to kind of switch things around and kind of be nimble and so forth, right? So the more we kind of have that, how much do we invest in our community for the quality of the conversation? Clearly, y'all are investing in that by being kind of in this program. So how do we change the way we engage? We do this quickly, so a few minutes here. So this is the bad news I showed earlier. Here's the good news. I'm just going to put it all up here. From the research, these are positive aspects of human nature we can tap into. Right? The first one is the other side of the coin of the us versus them, right? That there's a power of us, right? That we're not selfish, that we can connection. So as we see each other and people, we can tap into that. A lot of people want the same things. Right? Going back to the wicked problem side, one way to think about this is, in many ways, we all have the same values. What makes us different is how we rank those values. And those rankings matter because the issues we're dealing with inherently kind of engage those issues we're with. We're inherently empathetic, especially listening to each other's story, being at a table together. My students can report these aha moments, like, "Oh, that's why you think that way. It makes sense to me now. I still think you're wrong, right? I still think I like my arguments, but you seem I'm no longer defining you by what you're against or assuming negative motives. I can talk to that person. I can negotiate with that person. I can work with them, right? So how do we tap into that? Most importantly, that I've mentioned a few times, humans are really good pragmatic problem solvers when put in that situation. So how do we start organizing how we engage to tap into that, right? Rather than kind of rewarding people that are coming past each other. And while the negative stuff is stronger and easier to trigger, we can overcome that. Our brains can learn, right? The more we do this, the easier it is to do. And going back to the facts don't change minds when we're polarized, what does change minds is a genuine conversation with someone they have some trust with. That's where we see those shifts. That's where we see those aha moments. Even to the point of convincing white supremacists to leave white supremacist organizations, right? Listening is the most powerful tool, as kind of crazy as that sounds in a way. Look up Extreme Listening, the fascinating documentary, right? So that's how we're going to change minds if you're sure your side's right. So the work that I do, I call it deliberative engagement. There's a lot of different subfields about how to engage people differently. We know a lot about how to take on tough issues with diverse audiences. It's just sad how little our politics takes advantage of some of that research, right? So these are just some of the things I do in the meetings. I won't walk through these, so we're out of time, but you'll be doing some of this kind of inherently in here. This is just one great resource. The National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation has about a 20-page kind of summary of just different processes, different ways to engage people in much more productive ways, organized by processes to help people explore an issue, to transform a conflict, to make a decision together, or to spark collaborative action. We go into their conference here in 2 weeks. The overall work that I try to do is to shift from the assumption that wicked people wicked problems. That shifts us from adversarial to collaborative mode. That shifts from inciting the worst of human nature to the best. And then if you're a data person, you want facts. Facts don't work. Here they do. We want good information to help us kind of make better decisions. So the last thing I'm going to do is this, because I think it'll help be a good tool for y'all to have this semester. How many of you have seen this before? I'm kind of curious. So this is Sam Kaner's work. It's a great book. If today was interesting, The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making. He's more of an organizational consultant, right? But it works, I think, for democracy or for community. A participatory decision is the people that the decision impacts have a say in the decision, so democracy, right? But he talks about any tough decision needs to go through these 3 stages. So first is divergent thinking, second is working through the grown zone, and then third is convergent thinking. From a communication perspective, each of those stages take a different way of talking. Right? Most of our political stuff does a really good job of divergent thinking. One at a time, the microphone or message boards. We have all these chances for people to express their opinion. We have very little chances for people actually to talk to each other. When I'm training my student facilitators, right, I don't know if I ever mentioned that. So I train students in the classes and they help run our meetings, right? So 100 people show up to talk about an issue. We can split them up into 15 different tables with my students at every table, walking them through these processes that we train. Right? So I tell my students, like, if your table is struggling, it means it's working, right? Because these are tough issues, because we're identifying those tensions and we're putting them on the table and working through them. We're not letting people just have this simple kind of, my side, the best of my side versus the worst of their side. But there's also a problem because we get stuck in the growth zone and never make a decision. So convergent thinking is the tough process of making some decisions, of prioritizing. Going back to the wicked problem side, I'm not saying every single one of those boxes is just as important as the others, right? Different people will rank them differently. But in communities, we have to make decisions together, right? So that's one way to think about that is open-mindedness is awesome here. We want all kinds of ideas and everyone's opinion has value. Back here, we start closing our minds a little bit because where the evidence lies, where what values they tap into, what we want, who's won elections sometimes, right? But we make some tough decisions. So every opinion has value, but not every opinion is equally valid. And that's where, again, democracy and expertise kind of come together to help us kind of make the decisions and kind of move forward. Right? So the last one, so here was the vicious cycle. Here's the virtuous cycle, which research shows that the more we do this, the easier it is to do. You give people opportunities to have better conversations, right? They start developing some mutual understanding, not consensus, not agreement, but understanding, right? And that leads to build trust and respect. And that leads to processes that instead of just expressing your opinion, you're there to refine your opinion. You're there to improve your opinion based on data that's coming in, information they're sharing, based on conversations with people that might think differently than you, right? You're filling out your opinions. And that leads to the kind of capacity that we need in our communities for collaboration and co-creation that help us, again, have those kind of conversations. So one of my favorite, I talk fast already. Then I start losing time, so I talk faster. I do some stuff that's translated into Spanish as I'm talking, so the translators are next to me. And I do some with the ASL. And my favorite thing is I often kind of say, it's going to feel like drinking water from a water hose, because I'm going to throw a whole bunch of ideas out there. And the actual sign language thing for that is this. That always stuck with me, right? So threw a lot at you. Have some time for questions here, but you also have my email. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to talk more. I hope I run across y'all a lot. We got, and if you're here at Fort Collins in particular, the CBD runs a lot of meetings. You want to see what this looks like. If you email me, I'm happy to kind of put you on an event notification list that lets you know. You get like an email once a month or so. But with that, I'll stop talking and we'll have time for a few questions here, right? So, yeah.
Sorry. I am curious about the public discourse and so what, and how best to do that when the public is not as educated. I mean, would it be a circle of informed people, experts, talking and having the audience around, or would it be question and answer? What's the best?
Yeah, it depends on a lot of different factors, right? Most of our events, one of the things one of the bullet points on the slide are the components of what we do that I kind of skipped over is a discussion guide. Most of my events have some sort of discussion guide that people are kind of reacting to, right? And it's something specifically kind of created to spark conversation. So like I said before, from the divergent thinking, there's lots of opinions out there, right? A lot of noise. So what I try to do is make sense of all that noise to kind of create something that then people let it take. And we often call it a placemat, because when you show it to our events, you'll come to a round table with my students, and it'll likely be, sometimes it's a 4 or 5 page document. Sometimes it's like a 111 by 17. The water stuff was 111 by 17 piece of paper on what we should do about kind of water in Northern Colorado. 13 years ago, so I'm happy to share it if you're kind of curious. So a lot of my job is to translate all that. Now, some of that is going through filters, right? So if we hear in the noise misinformation, there's different ways for us to take that on. Sometimes just leave it out. Sometimes we heard it so often we have to take it on, like call it out in a sense. And then most of my events have some sort of presentation beforehand, right? Sometimes that presentation is pretty short. Sometimes it's a lot longer. When we did the water thing, water is complex as heck, as y'all know, right? So we actually had like, I don't know if it was monthly or bi-weekly, we had like public lectures first for a couple months, right? So we had hydrologists and we had water, the people that y'all will be talking to here, right? And we recorded those and had those on the public access channel and so forth, right? And it was only after like 3 months of those that we then kind of had these forums, right? And my students don't become experts on the topic, they're experts on the process, but we have to educate them enough to be able to help the conversation and know, so they had to watch all those and so forth, right? And then a lot of our processes, we have experts, walking around that the facilitators can kind of bring over. But a lot of what I try to do is how do we frame it so the conversation isn't an expert dominated conversation, it's more like what are the values that we're kind of dealing with. So there's a little bit back and forth there, but with most issues, Europe does this a lot more. They do these kind of really tough science issues. But what they do is they'll get 100 people that agree to kind of come for a 3-day thing, right? So they can spend the first day and a half educating on things, and then the next 2 days kind of deliberating. So it kind of depends on the issue. But we have basically found that when the key here is someone's designing that document for conversation, not for persuasion, right? We have a lot of information out there, people trying to convince you of things, right? It's a different art of like summarizing the arguments and having people react to them. And I think that's a key aspect. And it's funny, I've been using those for 18 years. When I went through the social psychology work, I'm like, oh, that's why those work, right? Of just realizing how, well, I won't get into that because there are probably other questions, right? But the really quick version of it is most people avoid conflict, right? Some people love conflict a little too much, right? And they're often pretty loud. And there's a very small percentage of people that can deal with conflict well. We're trying to grow those, even at least temporarily in 2 hours, right? But then hopefully kind of long term. And that discussion guide helps with that, right? Because if I'm having a conversation, you say something I really don't like, I'm probably not going to say anything, right? Because I don't want to, or I'm going to attack you because I feel very comfortable with you. But if we're reacting to this discussion guide with a summary of a whole bunch of she can say, I really like this one. Like, I don't. It just allows us to have a tough conversation we're not wired to have with people we disagree with, because we have this group project of improving the document. Right? And we always set up the document as a living, like, we didn't get it right. We're trying to summarize what we heard from people and filter it in terms of facts as necessary. But it's essentially giving them a group project, help us make this a better summary, right? Tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like, tell us what's missing. And that's what sparks these better conversations, because people don't have to win at the table, right? They're trying to work together to improve that document. While they're doing that, they're having a really good conversation on a tough issue. A question?
One more question?
I really like your dynamics of group decision-making graph, and I'm just sitting here thinking about polarization and people getting their feelings hurt or not agreeing with opinions or whatever we want to say, right? Conflict. And I think it's my opinion, but I'd love your view on it. Divergent thinking is all well and good when there does not have to be a decision.
Yeah.
But as soon as a decision has to be made with the best available facts, then when you bring people together and you're encouraging that divergent thinking, a certain amount of those people are going to get feelings hurt or they're going to be offended. They weren't listened to.
Yeah.
And so my question, I guess, is how do you continue, from your perspective, how do you continue to get people to the table when it might be once or it might be 10 times to where people or a group of people might say, you know what, I was there once or 10 times. You didn't listen to my thoughts then.
Right.
Now it is polarized because now I'm not going to even engage you anymore.
Right.
So it's kind of an opinion, but also a question, I guess, about how do you continue the discussion and try to elevate beyond some of these factors when it's so easy to stay polarized.
Right. Yeah, no, it's like one thing I'll say, that growth zone graphic is kind of time goes this way, right? But a lot of times, like, it's not like we're doing that whole graph in 2 hours, right? So we might, and divergent thinking, we don't need to be together for that, right? So divergent thinking, I can get opinions a lot of different ways. Almost all my events, we ask for an RCP and we ask some open-ended questions, right? Because I want to see, if we're creating a discussion guide, did I miss anything, right? So, and that's one of my things of people together in the same room is just precious time, right? So I don't want to waste their time. So I don't want to show up to a meeting and say, so what do y'all think about housing, right? I can ask them that beforehand and get all the opinions. So then when we're together, we can do more of the own stuff, right? But yeah, often, it's not like we know we finished divergent thinking, right? There's always gonna be someone like, there's something new when we think we're at the very end, right? That we have to kind of start over. But yeah, it's both the reality. The first problem is not allowing enough divergent thinking, right? I call that false consensus. It's like, we didn't let anyone disagree because we didn't invite them, right? Or if we invited them, they didn't show up, or if they showed up, they didn't feel comfortable speaking, or if they felt comfortable speaking, we shut them down. There's all these ways. So we jump to a decision without ever having difference in thinking. I think A, it's probably a bad decision, right? And then B, it's not going to be a supported decision, right? We know from the research that if people felt it was a legitimate process, they're much more likely to support the implementation, even if they're wrong. I mean, even if the decision goes against them, right? They have this notion of like, oh, I don't think that's the right decision. But if they felt they were heard and they were part of it, and that's kind of part of the scary part of our politics. There's so much of assumption of like, hey, we've got a 4-3 advantage. Let's just push it through and win. And that's the creation of the ordinance or the vote. But the actual implementation is where the hard work is done. And if half the people are dedicated to making that fail, it's going to fail. Or the next year, we're going to throw those people out of office and undo it, So that's where if you do the full process, even though it's painful, right? But yeah, hopefully, but there certainly are parts, to get more directly at your question, where the focus of our meeting is more the back end, right? And for those, we're going to be a little bit tighter, right? If someone has a brand new opinion, we're like, well, no, we're kind of being, we're reacting to this. Whereas at the beginning of the process, we're much more open-minded. Hey, you tell us what you think, right? We might not even have a discussion guide. We just have some questions. But as we kind of go through, if we feel comfortable that, hey, we've heard from, most of the kind of the affected voices, then we can start kind of closing it down a little bit. But there's always going to be people that try to parachute in at the end to kind of blow it up, right? So.
All right, I think we got to start to wrap up.
Yeah.
Let's get the presentation and talk. Yeah, thanks, John. And just to get back to something that Deb was asking about, how do we have conversations with the public if they aren't very educated on water? There are a lot of opportunities for the public to become educated on water, and I will mention just a few of them that we are involved with, the water center. So we are currently working with Larimer County to host a water education series. It's monthly sessions from 6 to 8 p.m. Thank you, Martin. We had our first one in August. The first one was in Fort Collins. The second one is actually coming up next week, September 20th. It's in Loveland, 6 to 8 p.m. There's info on our website. We can send it out afterward. The second one I just want to mention is I'm instructing a class on the South Platte River Basin. It's kind of a similar structure as this program, where we just cover all these different topics. We bring in guest speakers, but it's all focused on the South Platte, which is a lot of where a population lives, a lot of where agriculture is, it's a lot of where some of these big conflicts arise. So that is free and open to the public. You can come in person, it's on campus, or it's on Zoom. Again, that's on our website, and we can send out the link as well. I don't want to keep you too long. Can you pull up the slide with the book clubs?
Yeah.
I'm going to try every single month to get us out at 2 o'clock or earlier. So striving for that right now. So book club assignments. So I, put together these groups and assigned books to you all. And so those are the groups. And I think there's just one person who hadn't turned in their book preferences yet. So we'll also email this out, but these are your partners or groups of 3. Again, you just have to meet 2 times. You can do that in the period of class that's from 8:30 to 9. That's kind of an informal time for conversation. So I would encourage you to, use that time to meet with your group as we start to talk about your book. We do have some books that are available to lease out if you don't want to, go to the library or buy a book. We have a book list that, you can essentially check out a book. Did you send that yet or no?
I did not send out the book list, no,
Okay.
for the books that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I did not,
So
but I
we'll send
can.
that out and you can, essentially rent our books. But we have a lot of these books that are listed here. So this is, you're gonna be working with these folks going forward. We'll also send out a sign-up sheet for who will do the book reports in December and who will do them in April. So those on the December timeline, you're gonna have to move a little faster, but Yeah, any questions about anything? Yes,
So you're gonna email this out?
yes,
Are the slide decks from today gonna be available on the website?
yes.
Yep, everything will be made available on the website. It'll either be like the Friday or Monday after the session.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information on our website, and then we'll be sending out emails with reminders and resources.
All the
as well.
stuff.
So,
And what's the homework assignment that's due?
oh, the homework assignment, so every week or every month, and it's on the agenda, it's on the backside. There are the 3 questions, trying to find my agenda. Essentially, from your perspective as a community leader, what resonated with you? So what's your key takeaways? What questions do you have today after the session? What do you want to explore further? And then what things have you learned from history that you might find applicable in your current profession? And we will also email that out.
Yes.
So you know that.
Yep. Leave your name tags, just, we can bring them for you every time, just to make it easy for you. You don't have to remember anything.
Where do you want our boxes?
There's trash.
Here, you can leave it, I'll just fill a garbage bag or recycling it. Yeah, y'all can leave, I can grab garbage bags and take care of it. Yeah, no problem.
In October.
Yeah.